Margaret had always believed that love meant acceptance, but it wasn't until she found herself lying in a hospital bed, her hands wrapped in bandages, that she truly understood what those words meant. The afternoon sun streamed through the sterile window, casting gentle shadows across the room where she would spend the next several weeks of her life, and perhaps more importantly, where she would discover the difference between conditional love and the kind that sees beyond the surface. It had been 3 months since the fire at the community center, 3 months since her life had changed forever. Margaret closed her eyes and let her mind drift back to that October evening when everything she thought she knew about her marriage to Richard crumbled like the autumn leaves outside their suburban home. They had been married for 5 years, meeting at the local library where Margaret worked as a children's librarian and Richard served on the board of directors. He was distinguished, well-dressed, and spoke with the kind of confidence that drew people to him at social gatherings. Margaret recently emerged from a painful divorce, had been vulnerable and grateful for his attention. Richard saw in her something he could shape, mold into the perfect wife he had always envisioned. Their courtship was swift and seemingly romantic. Richard showered her with gifts and attention, but even then, Margaret sensed an underlying current of expectation. He would suggest she wear certain colors that complemented her complexion, recommend hairstyles that would frame her face better, and gently guide her toward activities that would enhance her social standing. At first, Margaret interpreted this as caring attention, the way a loving husband might want his wife to look and feel her best. But as the years passed, those suggestions became requirements. Richard's love seemed to come with conditions that grew more demanding with each season. Margaret found herself standing before the mirror each morning, not asking if she felt beautiful, but whether she met Richard's standards. She abandoned her comfortable reading glasses for contact lenses that irritated her eyes, traded her beloved cardigan sweaters for structured blazers, and spent increasingly more time and money on treatments and products designed to maintain what Richard called her natural beauty. The breaking point came during their annual visit to his company's holiday party. Margaret had spent hours preparing, choosing a dress Richard had approved, styling her hair the way he preferred, and applying makeup with the precision of an artist. But when they arrived at the elegant downtown hotel, she realized she had forgotten her special occasion earrings, the ones Richard had given her for their anniversary. "How could you forget?" Richard whispered harshly as they stood in the marble-floored lobby. "These events matter, Margaret. People notice these things. They notice us." Margaret felt the familiar knot in her stomach, the one that had become her constant companion over the past year. She apologized quietly, suggesting they could stop by a nearby store, but Richard's jaw tightened in that way she had learned to fear. "Just try to stay in the background tonight," he said, his voice cold. "I'll handle the important conversations." As the evening progressed, Margaret found herself gravitating toward the quieter corners of the ballroom, engaging in gentle conversation with the wives of Richard's colleagues while he networked with practiced charm across the room. She was speaking with Eleanor, the wife of the company's accountant, about their shared love of gardening when she noticed Richard's absence from his usual spot near the bar. Concerned, Margaret excused herself and began searching for him. The hotel was large with multiple event spaces, and she wandered through elegant hallways lined with artwork and fresh flowers. It was in the smaller conference room adjacent to the main ballroom that she found him, his arms around a woman she recognized as the young marketing coordinator from his office. The sight didn't shatter her heart so much as confirm what she had been trying to deny for months. This wasn't love, not the kind she had dreamed of, read about in the countless romance novels she had consumed in her youth. This was possession, control, and conditional acceptance. When Richard saw her standing in the doorway, he didn't look ashamed or apologetic. Instead, his eyes flashed with anger, as if she had violated some unspoken rule by discovering his betrayal. "We need to talk," Margaret said quietly, her voice steadier than she felt. The drive home was filled with accusations that left Margaret reeling. According to Richard, she had become complacent in their marriage, too focused on her work at the library, too comfortable in her appearance, too satisfied with their quiet life. He claimed he needed someone who understood the importance of maintaining standards, someone who wouldn't embarrass him in professional settings. "You used to try," he said, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel. "Remember when we first met? You cared about how you looked, about making a good impression. Margaret stared out the passenger window at the familiar streets of their neighborhood, houses warmly lit with the glow of family dinners and evening routines. I thought you loved me, she said softly. I loved who you could be, Richard replied, and those words would echo in Margaret's mind for months to come. It was during this emotionally charged conversation that Richard, distracted by his anger and the need to make his point, ran the red light at the intersection of Maple and 3rd Street. The delivery truck that hit them on Margaret's side of the car had been carrying supplies to the community center, boxes of craft materials and books for the after-school program she had helped organize. Margaret's last clear memory before the accident was the sight of those boxes flying through the air, their contents scattered across the asphalt like confetti at a celebration she would never attend. The irony wasn't lost on her later that the supplies meant to bring joy to children had become part of the chaos that changed her life forever. She woke up 2 weeks later in the burn unit of St. Mary's Hospital, her hands and arms wrapped in bandages, her face bearing the marks of her encounter with the twisted metal and broken glass. The nurse, a kind woman named Patricia, with gentle hands and a soothing voice, explained what had happened, the extent of her injuries, and the long road of recovery that lay ahead. Where is my husband? Margaret asked, her voice hoarse from the breathing tube that had been removed just days earlier. Patricia's pause told her everything she needed to know before the words came. He's been discharged, dear. He had some cuts and bruises, but nothing serious. He's been in touch with the hospital about your care. Margaret would later learn that in touch meant Richard had called twice in 2 weeks, once to inquire about insurance coverage and once to have her personal belongings collected from the car. He never visited, never sat by her bedside during the long nights when she fought infection and pain, never held her hand when the doctors explained that her hands would bear permanent scars from the burns. It was during her 3rd week in the hospital that Margaret met David, the man who would teach her what unconditional love actually looked like. He was in the room next to hers, a retired firefighter who had been injured while volunteering at a house fire. At 68, he was battling his own recovery from smoke inhalation and burns to his back and shoulders. Their first conversation happened by accident. Margaret had been struggling to open a water bottle with her bandaged hands when she heard a gentle voice from the hallway. Need some help there? She looked up to see a man in a hospital gown, his salt and pepper hair tousled from sleep, his face bearing the weathered lines of someone who had spent decades helping others. His eyes, a warm brown that reminded her of coffee on a cold morning, held a kindness she hadn't seen in years. I can manage, Margaret said automatically, the response Richard had trained into her whenever she showed any sign of need or vulnerability. I'm sure you can, David said with a gentle smile, but maybe you don't have to. He helped her with the water bottle, and that simple act of service without expectation became the foundation of a friendship that would grow into something neither of them had expected to find at this stage of their lives. David had been married for 42 years before losing his wife Susan to cancer 3 years earlier. He spoke of her often, but not with the bitter sadness Margaret expected. Instead, his stories were filled with laughter, small moments of joy, and a love that had deepened rather than diminished as they aged together. She was beautiful, he told Margaret one afternoon as they sat in the hospital's small garden, both of them finally well enough to venture outside. Not because she looked like a movie star, though she was certainly pretty when we were young, but because she was kind and funny, and she made me want to be a better man every single day. Margaret found herself crying then, not from sadness, but from the recognition of something she had never experienced. She was lucky to have you, she whispered. I was the lucky one, David replied, and Margaret could see in his eyes that he meant it completely. As the weeks passed and their recovery progressed, Margaret and David spent increasing amounts of time together. They attended physical therapy sessions where they encouraged each other through painful exercises. They shared meals in the hospital cafeteria, David helping Margaret cut her food when her hands were too stiff to manage the knife. They watched old movies on the small television in the common room, David patiently explaining plot points when Margaret's medication made it difficult to follow the story. Most importantly, they talked. Margaret found herself sharing stories she had never told anyone, childhood memories of helping her grandmother in the garden, dreams she had abandoned when she married Richard, fears about her future and whether anyone would ever love her with her scarred hands and the permanent reminder of the accident etched across her cheek. David listened to everything without judgment, without trying to fix or change her. When she worried about her appearance, he would take her bandaged hands in his own scarred ones and tell her that every mark on her body was proof of her strength, evidence that she had survived something that could have destroyed her. "You're not broken, Margaret," he would say when she struggled with particularly difficult days. "You're healing. There's a difference." It was David who was with her when Richard finally visited, 6 weeks after the accident. Margaret had been sitting in the garden, reading a book David had brought her, when she saw her husband approaching across the lawn. He looked exactly as he always had, impeccably dressed, not a hair out of place, his expression carefully neutral. "Margaret," he said, settling into the chair across from her, with the same formality he might use to address a business associate. "Richard." She marked her place in the book and set it aside, her hands trembling slightly. "You look," he began, then stopped, his eyes taking in the healing scars on her face and hands. "Different," Margaret finished for him. "I wanted to talk to you about our situation," Richard said, his voice devoid of warmth or concern. "I think we both know that things between us weren't working even before the accident." Margaret nodded slowly. She had expected this conversation, had been preparing for it during the long nights when sleep wouldn't come, but hearing the words still felt like a physical blow. "I've spoken to my lawyer," Richard continued, "and we can keep this simple. Clean. I don't want this to be more difficult than it needs to be." "Of course not," Margaret said quietly. "We wouldn't want to make things difficult for you." Something in her tone must have caught his attention, because Richard paused, studying her face with the kind of assessment she remembered from their early days together, as if he were trying to determine her market value. "I hope you understand," he said, "that I have certain expectations for my life, for my future. I need someone who can represent the kind of partnership I'm looking for." Margaret looked at this man she had been married to for 5 years, this man she had tried so hard to please, and felt nothing but pity. "I understand completely," she said. "I hope you find what you're looking for." After Richard left, Margaret sat in the garden until the sun began to set, thinking about the woman she had been and the woman she was becoming. When David found her there, she was crying, but not from sadness. "He's gone," she told him simply. David sat beside her on the bench and took her hand. "Are you okay?" Margaret considered the question seriously. Was she okay? Her face would always bear the scar from the accident. Her hands would never be smooth and unblemished again. Her marriage was over, and at 55, she was starting her life completely over with no clear idea of what came next. "I think I might be," she said, and realized she meant it. The divorce proceedings were swift and simple, just as Richard had promised. Margaret kept the house, her pension from the library, and most importantly, her newfound sense of self-worth. David, whose own recovery had progressed enough for him to return to his apartment across town, became a regular presence in her life. He would arrive each morning with coffee and fresh flowers from his garden, help her with tasks that were still difficult with her healing hands, and stay to share dinner and conversation that stretched late into the evening. They took walks through the neighborhood, David pointing out architectural details and sharing stories about the families who lived in each house. He taught her to tend the garden that had been neglected during her marriage to Richard, showing her how to coax life from soil that had seemed barren. "Plants are remarkable," David said one spring afternoon as they worked together to prepare the flower beds. "They adapt to their conditions, find ways to thrive even when circumstances aren't ideal." Margaret looked up from the seeds she was planting, dirt under her fingernails, her scarred hands gentle with the tender seedlings. "Like people," she said. "Like people," David agreed. Their relationship grew slowly, naturally, without the urgency and conditions that had marked Margaret's marriage to Richard. David never asked her to change her appearance, never criticized her choices, never made their love contingent on her meeting some external standard. Instead, he seemed to delight in discovering who she really was beneath the layers of self-doubt and people-pleasing that had defined her for so long. When Margaret expressed uncertainty about wearing short sleeves because of the scars on her arms, David would kiss each mark gently and tell her they were beautiful, because they were part of her story. When she worried about introducing him to her colleagues at the library because she wasn't sure how to explain their relationship, he reminded her that their love didn't require anyone else's approval or understanding. "We're not performing for an audience," he told her. "We're just living our lives." It was a concept so foreign to Margaret after years with Richard that it took months for her to fully embrace it. But gradually she began to relax into the peace of being loved exactly as she was. 2 years after the accident, Margaret and David were married in a small ceremony in the garden behind her house. She wore a simple dress she had chosen herself, her hair styled in a way that felt comfortable and natural, her scarred hands bare except for the wedding ring David had chosen with her, not for her. Margaret's colleagues from the library attended, along with David's firefighter friends and the neighbors who had become like family during her recovery. There were no elaborate flowers or expensive decorations, just the simple beauty of two people promising to love each other through whatever came next. The wedding photos showed Margaret laughing as David whispered something in her ear during the ceremony, her face radiant with joy, despite the faint scar that traced along her cheek. Looking at those pictures later, Margaret marveled at how different she looked from the woman who had tried so desperately to meet Richard's standards. This woman looked genuinely happy, comfortable in her own skin, loved for who she was rather than who she might become. 5 years into their marriage, Margaret and David were enjoying a quiet dinner at Romano's, their favorite Italian restaurant, when Margaret spotted a familiar figure across the room. Richard sat alone at a corner table, his suit as perfectly tailored as ever, his hair still styled with precision. But there was something different about him, something that made Margaret look twice. He was alone, completely alone, and there was a quality to his solitude that spoke of more than just dining solo. His eyes moved restlessly around the room, never settling on any one thing for long, as if he were searching for something he couldn't find. The confidence that had once defined him seemed forced now, a performance without an audience. Margaret watched as he checked his phone repeatedly, perhaps hoping for a message that never came. She saw him signal the waiter with the impatience of a man accustomed to having his needs met immediately, but when the waiter approached, Richard's smile was strained, almost desperate. "Is that—" David followed her gaze and recognized the man Margaret had described from her previous life. "Yes," Margaret said quietly. "That's Richard." They watched as Richard finished his meal quickly, as if eating were a task to be completed rather than enjoyed. When he stood to leave, Margaret could see that his perfect posture had developed a slight slump, as if the weight of maintaining his image had become too heavy to bear. "He looks—" David paused, searching for the right word. "Lonely," Margaret finished. "He looks lonely." As they walked to their car after dinner, Margaret reflected on the unexpected emotion she felt seeing Richard again. It wasn't anger or sadness or even satisfaction at his apparent solitude. It was something closer to gratitude, mixed with a deep sense of pity for a man who had never learned to love without conditions. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if things had been different?" David asked as they drove home through the familiar streets of their neighborhood. Margaret considered the question as they passed the intersection where her old life had ended and her new one had begun. The traffic light was green now, allowing them to continue smoothly toward home, toward the life they had built together. "I used to," she said honestly, "but not anymore. I can't imagine being anyone other than who I am right now, living any life other than the one we've created together." David reached over and took her hand, his thumb tracing gently over the scars that had become as familiar to him as his own skin. "I love your hands," he said, as he had countless times before. "They tell the story of a woman who survived, who fought, who chose to keep living and loving, despite everything that tried to break her." Margaret smiled, thinking of all the ways those scarred hands had been put to use in the years since the accident. They had planted gardens and prepared meals, comforted crying children at the library, held David during his own difficult moments, and created a home filled with warmth and acceptance. "They're working hands," she said, "hands that have learned to love without fear." As they pulled into their driveway, Margaret saw the garden they had cultivated together, now in full bloom despite the approaching autumn. The flowers they had planted that first spring had grown and multiplied, creating a riot of color and life that transformed their small yard into something beautiful. The house welcomed them with warm light spilling from the windows, the promise of evening tea and conversation, books to be read aloud to each other, and the simple pleasure of falling asleep beside someone who loved her completely. Margaret had learned that true beauty wasn't about meeting someone else's standards or maintaining a perfect appearance. It was about the courage to be vulnerable, the wisdom to recognize authentic love, and the strength to choose healing over bitterness. Her scars had become symbols not of damage, but of resilience, proof that she had survived the fire and emerged stronger. As she and David settled into their evening routine, Margaret caught sight of herself in the hallway mirror. The woman looking back at her was 58 years old, her hair now silver at the temples, her face bearing the lines of laughter and the mark of her survival. Her hands, with their network of scars, were gentle and capable, hands that had learned to receive love as freely as they gave it. She was not the woman Richard had wanted her to be, and she was grateful for that failure. She was not perfect by any conventional standard, and she was grateful for that too. She was herself, fully and completely, loved and loving, scarred and beautiful, imperfect and whole. In the kitchen, David was preparing their evening tea, humming softly as he worked. He looked up when she entered and smiled, the same warm smile that had greeted her in the hospital hallway all those years ago. "There you are," he said, as if her presence still surprised and delighted him after all this time. "Here I am," Margaret replied, settling into the life she had never known she wanted, the love she had never known she deserved, and the peace she had never known was possible. Outside, the garden they had planted together rustled in the evening breeze, their imperfect paradise blooming under the stars, proof that the most beautiful things in life often grow from the most broken ground.